At around 4 a.m., the nurse led me into the intensive care ward and pulled back the curtain. There was my wife, unrecognizable. Her face was swollen as if she had drowned, and her body had been pulled out after days in the water. For the only time in my life, I nearly fainted. The nurse gently led me to a chair and got me a cup of water. Anya was not dead. The swelling was the result of lying face down on a special surgical table used for brain surgery. 15 hours. I had arrived in the surgical waiting room after work. As the clock ticked on, the room slowly emptied until I was alone. Sometime after 2 a.m., the nurse suggested I come up to the ICU to try and sleep on one of the couches there. A few hours later, I was nudged awake. It was a surgeon, washed clean, standing in front of me in new scrubs. He explained in perfectly understandable terms what had happened through the long day and night of surgery. This man is a hero, I thought, worth every cent he has paid. In the days that followed, Anya barely moved. She needed a small vacuum tube to remove her saliva, lest she choke on it. She couldn't talk. One of her vocal cords wasn't working. Trying to talk was like trying to clap with one hand. Would she recover from this? Would she ever sing again? You see, from age 10 to age 18, Anya had sung as a member of the Soviet State Children's Choir, which traveled with Gorbachev on state visits. To help her find her place in Toronto, I had engaged a neighbor from the Canadian Opera Company to give her lessons so she could audition for one of the top choirs in the country. She became a member of the alto section. But now what? For 6 weeks, I took the 1 hour trip from work to the hospital and spent the 2 hours until visiting time was over beside her bed. At first, I only held her hand, something my clergyman father had taught me to do years ago when visiting the sick. Then, as she gained energy, she wrote on a notepad. She would give me messages to pass on to her mother in Moscow and her sister in Norway. In turn, they would email me messages in Russian for her, which I printed off and brought to the hospital. Slowly, thankfully, the vocal cord began to work again, but her recovery was far from over, and inevitably, the hospital needed the bed. She was transferred to a rehab hospital in the far east end of the city. That trip required me to travel from work south, then east, for over an hour and a half, and then walk another 20 minutes to the rehab hospital. And then afterwards, another trip home, a long one. I just couldn't keep it up every day. So I tried to go on weekends and a few times during the week. Anya recovered slowly, but she hated the rehab hospital. It was an ancient hospital, tarted up with new coats of ugly paint. She was only 30 then. Most of her fellow patients were seniors, most with brain injuries or brain diseases. She was desperately lonely. I brought her magazines and books. I bought her an iPod and loaded it with some of her favorite music. As time passed, her hair grew, including the hair where there had been a large bald patch from the operation. She wanted to cut it, but couldn't quite manage. So I, who was afraid to cut our dog's nails, volunteered. It's oddly intimate, cutting someone's hair, frequently touching the head, checking to see that each snip is right. I began to understand how women's hairdressers become gossips or pseudo therapists. It was a flood, a unique flood of feeling connected. But then the time came when I couldn't visit. I was heading to London, England for an annual 2 weeks of meetings. I was CEO of a national association of tax and estate planning professionals, lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors. The Canadian organization was part of an international network that met once a year. Cell phones weren't allowed in the hospital, and Anya was not yet well enough to make it to the common room where she could access email. It was a tearful goodbye. Upon my return, I met with our family doctor. She had received a full report from the surgeon. The tumor had been like a jellyfish, the body sitting on top of Anya's brain, the tentacles reaching into the folds of it. The doctor explained that it had affected Anya's lower body, her ability to feel anything below the waist, her motor skills. That explained a lot. Why she had begun to fall off her bike, trip while walking, and even burn herself while cooking when she leaned too close to the stove. It also explained our intimacy challenges in the bedroom. But it did not account for Anya's emotional state, her bouts of depression, her flashes of intense anger and extreme volatility. That, the doctor said, was something else, something that had been around before the tumor and would likely stay unless Anya did something about it. She was on antidepressants, but she refused to go to a therapist. In Russia, she liked to joke, we don't have problems, we have vodka. And though she could drink me and any of my friends under the table, she was mercifully not a big drinker. Instead, she was a hoarder. Shoes, perfume, makeup. One drawer of the fridge was stuffed full of lipsticks that inevitably would otherwise degrade. Worse were the fights. They had become more and more frequent, about twice a month, each round followed by days of silence. It was excruciating. My health deteriorated, chest pains, blood pressure through the roof. I was scared. Finally, one Saturday morning, I'd had enough. I carried my coffee into the bedroom, sat down on the bed, and told Anya, it's over. She said she'd been waiting a while for me to say this. It would be several months before her brain tumor was discovered. For the next few weeks, as we negotiated, separated our stuff, and readied the flat to be sold, we got along better than we had in months. Polite consideration, laughter, but then came the final night in the flat. Again, hell opened up. Tempers flared, higher and higher. And then Anya did something she had never done before. She stood with her face close to mine and issued a challenge. What are you going to do now? Hit me? I froze, faced with a choice I had never faced before. In those long seconds, my father's voice came to me, a conversation we had had when I was still in high school. Now, Stewart, if you ever feel you're out of control, stop. Go for a walk until you cool off. I turned from Anya, went to the front door, grabbed my coat, and left. I walked and walked and walked until the red that was completely clouding my vision cleared. The next morning, I woke knowing I had made the right choice. Arguments were inevitable, but not this. My lawyer brain said, you could have lost your license or your liberty. My soul said, this was not the marriage you wanted. A year passed, the judge signed our divorce order. More time passed, we lost touch. But a mutual friend told me Anya had remarried. That marriage, too, it seems, was a battlefield. Worse, she challenged her second husband to hit her, and he obliged. He took off her glasses and smashed her in the face. She called the police. He was arrested, charged, and convicted. The marriage ended. Neither one of us married a further time, but I can report that the cancer hasn't come back, and Anya still sings alto in the choir.